Good evening. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Christopher Scalia. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the fifth installment of the American Dream Lecture Series. A component of AEI's American Dream Initiative, this series seeks to revitalize our nation's core institutions and values by inviting prominent writers, academics, and thinkers to address some of the most significant political, cultural, and social issues facing the United States. As we approach the 250th anniversary of America's founding, these lectures are an opportunity to ask, how healthy are our national institutions and foundational principles? What threats do they face? And what prospects for reform are available? Last September, we invited tonight's speaker to discuss anti-Semitism in the United States. That was nearly a month before Hamas's attack on Israel and the ensuing pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protests on campuses around the United States. I wish our invitation had not become so much more relevant. In January, the Anti-Defamation League reported more than 3,000 anti-Semitic incidents between October 7th and January 7th, an increase of 361% compared to the same period the previous year. And as we've seen campus protests explode over the past month into encampments and building takeovers, with the overt hatred expressed toward Jews and the Jewish state of Israel, it's more important than ever to understand the history and nature of anti-Semitism. This evening's guest is an invaluable guide for these times, someone who can bring both light and, when necessary, heat to questions about anti-Semitism as a distinctively political phenomenon, about the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-liberalism more generally, about how anti-Semitism's roots in 19th century Germany, as well as its eventual adoption by the Soviet Union, can help us understand what we see going on around us today, and whether legislation such as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that recently passed the House is the best way to address the problem. Dr. Ruth Wisse is Harvard University's Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature Emerita. Born in Romania in 1936, she was 4 years old when her family emigrated to Montreal. She earned her BA from McGill University, her master's from Columbia, and then back to McGill for her PhD. There, she helped found the Department of Jewish Studies before venturing to Harvard, where she taught until 2014. She's the author of several books, including If I Am Not for Myself, The Liberal Betrayal of Jews, Jews and Power, and Free as a Jew, a personal memoir of national self-liberation. Apologies to those of you watching online, but we have free copies of that memoir for all of you attending in person today, or for many of you attending in person today, probably not all of you. She has also co-edited or edited collections of Yiddish fiction and poetry and has contributed essays to many outlets, including National Affairs, Commentary, and the Wall Street Journal. Her honors include the National Humanities Medal and an honorary degree from Yeshiva University. Dr. Wisse will speak about anti-Semitism for about 30 minutes, after which she'll be joined on stage for a discussion with Matthew Continetti. Mr. Continetti is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and the inaugural Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity here at AEI, where his work focuses on American political thought and history. He was opinion editor at the Weekly Standard, as well as the founding editor and editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. He's a contributing editor at National Review, a columnist for Commentary, and has been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. You may have seen him on TV, Fox News Channel's Special Report with Bret Baier, NBC's Meet the Press, and you'll hear his dulcet tones on the Commentary podcast a few times every week. He's the author of 3 books, including most recently, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. And he, like Dr. Wisse, has a degree from, of all places, Columbia. Dr. Wisse and Mr. Continetti will converse for about 20 minutes, then we'll turn to audience questions. Afterward, I hope you'll join us for light refreshments and conversation in the adjoining gallery. But now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Wisse.
Yes, thank you. Shall I pull this down a bit? Thank you very, very much. This is the place to be, and among people I read and admire, and just I'm just overwhelmed by what you say, because in fact I've been thinking about and writing about these ideas for years, and one does not want to have them come to life in the way that they have done recently. So I think that it is customary to try to warm up an audience with a joke. So why don't I try one? This one from the First World War. The mayor of a French town directs his deputy to round up all the Jews and all the bicyclists. And the deputy says, "Why the bicyclists?" You're not laughing. But if it didn't bring down the house, I'm sure that it's not just my telling, although I'm not a comedian by nature. But you're not yet in the spirit of our subject, anti-Semitism, which is the most improbably successful ideology and political strategy of modern times. Can you think of anything that is weirder than American students in the land of the free and the home of the brave supporting Hamas Islamists against Israel? In 1945, Americans, the decisive force defeating Hitlerism, discovered the remnant of the 6 million Jews whom the Germans and their willing executioners, in Daniel Goldhagen's felicitous phrase, had managed to cleanse from the continent. But anti-Semitism had done no less to destroy Germany, a fact that we sometimes overlook, and that should be emphasized, I would say, more than the fact that it destroyed the Jews. Once the generative center of European culture, Goethe, Schiller, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, archaeology, philosophy, psychology, modernism, and whatnot, its reputation was now forever ruined, scrubbing its hands like a deathless Lady Macbeth. In that same decade of the 1940s, the Jews reestablished their national sovereignty in the land of Israel that had been under foreign occupation for 2 millennia. And that is the difference between a civilization of builders and a civilization of destroyers. Anti-Semitism is not about the Jews, but about those who organize politics against them. And any society governed by that ideology is doomed. Yet here we are, with a growing part of the student population, and not just the student population of America, advocating the same politics of destruction that America went to war to defeat. It is certainly the stuff of black humor, but I feel compelled to take it seriously, as of course you do here. So our subject is anti-Semitism in America. But the only way I can understand it, as Chris said, is to say how we got here. And in order to do that, one has to understand what anti-Semitism really is, how it works, why it succeeds. I realize how hard committees have worked to craft the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and I do hope that its adoption will make some difference. But I view anti-Semitism rather as the organization of politics against the Jews, and as an instrument of modern politics directed at whatever the Jews represent. To begin to understand it, what we ask is, who are its sponsors and its adherents? Whom does it benefit? What do they gain by it? How do they advocate it? Who is susceptible? What are its functions? How does it succeed? Now, there are always good reasons for targeting the Jews rather than any other group, but these follow from the anti-Semites' need for them as target. So the obvious point of departure, as was said, and some of this I have written about in National Affairs, actually, so thank you to its editor. The obvious point of departure for understanding anti-Semitism is the movement by that name, established by Wilhelm Marr in 1879 in Germany as the Antisemiten League, the Anti-Semitism League. Marr was a disappointed man of the left who had come to fear the consequences of emancipation that were taking hold of Europe. He identified Jews, the most obvious beneficiaries of liberalization, as the cause of its problems, warning that Jews were conquering Germany from within, warning against the victory of das Judentums über das Germanentum, that the poor Germans were being overtaken, he claimed, by Jewishness. So rather than actually address the serious difficulties, and they were serious, that Germany faced in adjusting to its many political, economic, cultural challenges, his movement explained them as the fault of the Jews and called for political action against them. And I would say that here are some of its functions. So first, the politics of the pointing finger. It offered explanation and solution. As explanation, the Rothschilds have taken your money. The Jews have taken your jobs. Jews have taken over journalism, music, literature, art. Heine corrupts our poetry. Freud corrupts our youth. Some Christians blamed Jews for weakening the authority of the church. The rising middle class resented the Jews' strong competition. The visible prominence of Jews made them a credible explanation, while the political dependency of the Jews made them an ideal target. This explanation came with a simple solution. It was profitable to remove or to destroy the Jews, and there was no political price to be paid for their elimination. So next, scapegoating, a word which is always used in this connection, it deflected attention from the real causes of the problems, and it masked the accuser's anti-liberal attempt to gain power. A negative campaign needs no positive program beyond the promise of more Lebensraum, more of everything, once the Jews are cleared away. And if I may demonstrate what a pointing finger does, if you follow the pointing finger, you see what you don't see in prestidigitation is the hand of the person who's actually performing the deed. So it takes attention away from whatever those people are doing, what they stand for, and that makes it very effective. Third, and I would say that this is one of its most important functions, anti-Semitism is the great coalition builder. Although Marr differentiated his movement from Christian opposition to Judaism, which is why he chose that name, not anti-Judaism or anything like that, he drew on the negative stereotype of the Jew, and he was joined by conservative Christians as well as secular ultranationalists. Other movements forced and still force choices between internationalism and nationalism, secular and religious, liberal and conservative, left and right. A small people with a hugely inflated variable image, Jews were the ultimate unifying target. Coalition building remains one of the main functions of organizing politics against the Jews, and if you think ahead, we'll come to that, to the UN, and of course, intersectionality on the campuses. So explanation, solution, deflection, coalition builder. Anti-Semitism was also a unilateral negative campaign. Now, negative campaigning may be vulgar, dishonest, cruel. Trump is a criminal demagogue. Sleepy Joe can't find his tongue, and so on. But all democracies engage in it, not so against the Jews, a minority by choice that needs coexistence It needs reciprocal tolerance from the surrounding society, and it needs tolerance from precisely the people who are most against it. So Jews lack any incentive for attacking the surrounding majorities. They have every disincentive to attack those who are doing them harm. Now, I'm not speaking here about the moral basis of Jewish civilization, but about its political consequences. Jews are an anti-imperial people. Accepting the Torah at Sinai created a contractual, self-limiting relationship with the divine authority that granted them a small land with no guarantees of keeping it and no claim to any other. This unique arrangement created not just disparity, but a radical political contrast between Jews and other nations that makes them uniquely susceptible to attack. There's much more to be said about the Jewish side of this complementarity, but for the moment, our focus stays on those who exploit this unique political opportunity that the Jews represent. Now, this is to say that anti-Semitism had a winning political strategy. By the end of the 19th century, the mayor of Vienna was elected on a platform of anti-Semitism. Hitler rose to power in Germany in the 1920s, defeating liberal and communist opposition to become the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, waging that same anti-Jewish war, Kampf, to which Nazism had added the accusation of polluting the Aryan race. By 1945, Jews had been eliminated, not just from Germany, but from most of Europe. So what we have here is not, as you hear it all the time, the longest hatred, the dislike of the unlike, discrimination, or any of the ways that social scientists have tried to theorize this as one example of something larger. Anti-Semitism is the larger idea or ideology that takes over societies by seeming to be only against the inconsequential Jews. But before getting to the here and now, we have to go back to see how anti-Zionism, although not yet by that name, emerged in tandem with anti-Semitism. The Enlightenment recast religion in political terms. And unlike Christianity, which separates what is owing to Caesar from what is owing to God, Judaism is a national religion, or as Mordechai Kaplan put it, a religious civilization. Jewish religion is indivisible from nationality. So the French National Assembly's idea of toleration accorded equal rights to Jews as individuals, but granted them nothing as a nation. Captain Alfred Dreyfus could become the ideal French citizen, yet remain suspect of treason as a Jew. Bruno Bauer and Karl Marx's debate over the status of Jews as citizens in a post-Christian and post-national world confirmed, first, that Jews were now to be considered in political, not religious terms, but this made the Jewish question, or the Jewish problem as it had become, the main sticking point of internationalism. Marx claimed to be speaking in socioeconomic political terms, yet he drew from Christianity the notion that the existence of the Jews prevented universal salvation. In order for his conception of historical progress to work, the Jews would have to dissolve themselves as a people. Now, Marx was explicit in defining the Jew as huckster, hence the need for his elimination. And I would say that rereading Marx on the Jewish question is a good way to fathom what is being taught in our universities. And here I'll quote, "An organization of society which would abolish the preconditions for, and therefore the possibility of huckstering, would make the Jew impossible. His religious consciousness would be dissipated like a thin haze in the real vital air of society. On the other hand, if the Jew recognizes that this practical nature of his is futile and works to abolish it, he extricates himself from his previous development and works for human emancipation as such, and turns against the supreme practical expression of human self-estrangement. We recognize, this is still Marx, we recognize in Judaism, therefore, a general antisocial element of the present time, an element which through historical development to which, in this harmful respect, the Jews have zealously contributed, has been brought to its present high level at which it must necessarily begin to disintegrate. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. Now, the political functions of this eliminationist anti-Jewishness were the same as Wilhelm Marr's: pointing finger as explanation and solution, scapegoating, coalition building, negative campaigning, and so on. But this, I would argue, proved much more lethal because it spoke in the name of progress, and progress on the way to universal salvation. Why more lethal? Well, let me suggest some ways. Whereas opposition to the Jews as enemy aliens required only their physical removal, which led Moses Hess and Theodor Herzl and many Zionists to believe that they could normalize the Jewish condition by recovering the national sovereignty in the land of Israel, and they did. The internationalist, ideological versions of socialism and communism required the removal of Jewish civilization. Dissolving the Jews was the precondition for the international and the first necessary step in the process. Secondly, whereas opposition to the Jews as enemy aliens exclude them by definition, anti-Zionism demanded that Jews participate in the higher cause of self-dissolution. Like Jews for Jesus, but without the need for conversion, communism insisted that Jews transcend their Jewishness and that they eliminate fellow Jews who wouldn't. Anti-Jewish Jews, in the process of being more progressive, could feel themselves to be idealistic, while aggressing against their fellow Jews as they would never dare to do against Gentiles. Just parenthetically, the Marxist intellectual, of course, Isaac Deutscher, writing very engagingly, described the non-Jewish Jews. That's the kind of paradoxical formulation that intellectuals adore. But many Marxists were actually anti-Jewish Jews, not paradoxical at all, but committed to the evolutionary disappearance of the Jewish people. And thirdly, whereas American democracy could accommodate the idea of a Jewish people by allowing its citizens freedom of religion and association, communism termed Zionism reactionary, the national movement that prevented human progress. In 1929, the Soviet Union hailed the Muslim Brotherhood's pogroms in Palestine as the start of the Arab Revolution and demanded that all Jewish communists, including the thousands in America, do likewise. It disseminated all the current slogans against Zionism as colonialist, imperialist, and racist. Moscow's Patrice Lumumba University educated third world students like Mahmoud Abbas in anti-Zionism and exported it to countries that had never known Jews. The anti-Jewish political strategies of Nazis, Soviets, and Arab nationalists and Islamists were aligned in the 1930s, despite their hostility to one another. You see, coalition building. Jewish Jews were not inactive through all of this, of course. Their main response to emancipation, not unlike the Poles and Italians and others, was to reclaim national sovereignty without awaiting divine intervention. Though that was not the main impulse for its founding, the Zionist movement expected that by removing the Jews from where they were not wanted and normalizing their political status, they would end anti-Semitism. In this alone, Zionism was greatly mistaken. Although the recovery of Israel gave the Jews agency and self-defense once they mastered it, organizing politics against the Jews in their homeland proved to be even more politically effective than it had been against them in dispersion. The Arab League was founded in 1945 as an anti-Zionist league with all the familiar functions, the pointing finger, consolidating the Arab-Muslim unity against a common target, and, of course, deflecting attention from the daunting challenges of modernization that all these regimes and their leaders faced. Conquest is to Islam as coexistence is to Judaism, creating the familiar political complementarity between the desire for hegemonic expansion on the one side and the need for accommodation on the other. Muslims knew Jews as subject, and they expected them to stay that way. In the 1950s, common opposition to Israel led Arab and Muslim leaders to form a coalition with the Soviets, and after the Arabs had lost the Soviet-backed wars against Israel of 1967 and 1973, they commandeered the United Nations to mount an ideological war from that platform. Ideological, of course, and deeply political. And this begins to bring the subject home. It was the United Nations that sanctioned the partition of Palestine in 1947 and welcomed Israel as its 57th member the following year. Yet the Arabs refused partition outright, insisting that the Palestinian Arabs remain refugees as permanent claimants to the Jewish state, vowing to drive Jews into the sea. And by the way, I think people here know that that is the Mediterranean, right? Because these countries launched against Israel a war so asymmetrical that it could only be ended by the belligerents. To all the existing functions and strategies of organizing politics against the Jews, these leaders added a perpetually displaced refugee population to be maintained as the alleged victims of Jewish occupation and to be used as a permanent excuse for continued aggression. Now, Christianity, which has come a long way, I think, I know, had once used the imagery of Christ's stigmata to incite violence against the Jews. But these never-to-be-settled refugees were to be living victims, while also active terrorist proxies whose usefulness to their fellow Arabs and Muslims would be defined by the damage they could do to Israel. Now, on November 10th, 1975, the Soviet and Arab Muslim voting blocs passed the UN Resolution 3379, determining that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Through an inversion that was bolder than that of Wilhelm Marr, Arab countries refusing coexistence blamed Israel for its racism. The US representative to the United Nations, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, called November 10th a day of infamy, aware that democratic Israel was a proxy for the United States and its democratic allies, but rather than wage war against this infamy, the Western democracies allowed the UN and its agencies to promote anti-Zionism in countries that had rarely seen a Jew. Now, it's that UN resolution cemented, that very resolution, which no one seemed to pay any attention to. It cemented the Red-Green alliance against Israel. And what it did was it ingeniously shifted anti-Semitism of the Arab Muslim world from right to left, from "we will drive you into the sea" to defining Palestinians as the victims of colonialist, discriminatory Israel. And this is how anti-Zionism penetrated the liberal left and how it became the poster child of the grievance coalitions. Of course, politics is not as schematic as I am putting it here, and there are many stages of the process that I'm describing. And nor, by the way, is this intended to deny the suffering of refugees, which many of us have personally experienced. It just turns the pointing finger back to where it belongs, back to those who do the pointing. Arab and Muslim leaders, freed of their colonial overseers, but at a great competitive disadvantage, found in anti-Israel politics the same opportunities as fascism and communism, but on a much larger scale. Anti-Zionism, nay anti-Semitism, why don't I just call it anti-ism, penetrated the United States both from the outside and the inside. The Arab lobby used its economic and political advantages to further anti-ism's belligerent aims. Funding universities was only the most obvious of its methods. Many of those professors, students, imams from Arab and Muslim lands were imbued with anti-ism, and some were professionally engaged by their host countries to spread it. Others went into politics and formed political constituencies. No one doubts the sincerity of Ilhan Omar and fellow members of the squad. In Jewish terms, we call this FFB, Frum from birth. And they were raised on anti-ism. And this being a free country, they insist that they have a right to promote the destruction of Israel as part of their culture. And that just as German Americans rallied openly against the Jews in the 1930s. Yet here is something interesting. No one told the immigrants from lands where Israel is demonized and where martyrdom promised to its destroyers that it is anti-American to promote Arab war against the Jews in this country. They obviously realized that some of their beliefs were taboo. They do not promote the prosecution of homosexuals and lesbians or the practice of female circumcision, which are also practiced in some of their home countries. Yet they may have grown ever more confident in spreading the infamy of anti-Zionism. Why is that? Now, Barack Obama, who was raised on Muslim anti-Semitism, schooled in the anti-Zionism of his radical left colleagues in Chicago, exposed to the anti-colonialist atmosphere of Edward Said's Columbia University, topped off in the anti-Semitic church of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. May I say that I don't think that there's another man on the planet, any individual on the planet, that was formed by the four major kinds of anti-ism. But you see, he knew that he could not run for the presidency on a platform of anti-Semitism. And indeed, he knew that he would have to repudiate it in order to win election, although the only branch of anti-Semitism that he repudiated was the one of Reverend Wright's, not the others. But that is no longer true for the young Hamas enthusiasts who are training to run for office, as you can see from their bullhorns. What has changed, and whom does that benefit? So the anti-ist assault from inside America has been even greater than that from the outside, powered by the old and new leftists and a professoriate, part of which wants to transform America. The anti-war movement of the 1960s, that traced its lineage back to the anti-capitalist movement of the 1930s, found its home in the universities. It joined forces with the radical feminists against patriarchy, with Black nationalists against white supremacy, in an intersectional coalition of grievance and blame. So intersectionality needed something, however, to coalesce against. It found its uniform in the keffiyeh, its anti-colonialist cause in anti-Zionism, its outlet for anger in taunting Jews, and so on. The grievance movements mounted many, many protests, but until now, they had lacked the advantage of anti-ism. The war against the Jews galvanized aggression against the Jewish target, and its effect cannot be denied. I don't think the enormity of the Palestinian Hamas attacks on Israel of October 7th has yet fully sunk in. But the greatest shock for some of us was that more than 30 Harvard grievance groups were ready to accuse Israel the following day. After 21 years at Harvard, having called attention to the expansion of antiism, I was nonetheless stunned by how well organized, highly motivated, full-throated in self-confidence, and passionately focused this coalition had grown. You are all here experts on American politics, yet I imagine that most of you are also surprised by the revealed power of the antis. And let's not be blind to what I have always seen as being so important to this movement, the exquisite fun of that unilateral campaign against the Jews and Israel. It is marvelous to see the Jews run, to put them on the defensive, to feel superior at their expense. It is great fun to have infiltrated the Democratic Party and help to make it ensure a Hamas victory over Israel, which it seems to me that parts of the Democratic Party are now intent on doing. The war against the Jews cannot end well for America or for the Middle East unless all of this is repudiated and crushed as decisively as one hopes that Israel will be able to dismantle Hamas. This cannot end well unless the United States and its willing allies stop Iran from promoting the Islamist version of the anti-ist coalition. So we're here to fight for our precious republic and for the precious state of Israel in the war of ideas. I hope that it has helped somewhat to try to explain the nature and the danger of organizing politics against the Jews, the ubiquity of its appeal, and what happens when liberals don't confront it in time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ruth, for that amazing lecture. As I was listening, I recalled something that our colleague Howard Husak reminded me of the other day, which is a comment by Prime Minister Netanyahu that you are of equal value to the state of Israel as a division of the IDF. And when Howard reminded me of this, he said, you know, it could be apocryphal, but I told him that back in my journalism days, we had something called too good to check. So I'm just going to state it as true for the record. That lecture was so rich, it's hard to know where to begin. I have so many questions, and we will have time for audience questions as well. I thought we might approach the subject by focusing just on a few dates, and then I have some more general conceptual questions for you, too. And I want to focus on the campus first. A lot of parallels have been drawn between what is happening on campuses now and what happened in 1968 with campus protests over the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. I'm wondering, though, that rather than parallelisms, we can also view what's happening as a consequence of 1968. And I think of two things that happened as a result of those protests almost 60 years ago. One was the establishment of studies departments, ethnic studies, African American studies, eventually Middle East studies. And the other, particularly on Ivy League campuses, was the banishment of the Reserve Officer Training Corps from elite schools. And you've written about both subjects in the past. Could you trace for us how those decisions 60 years ago created the culture that we see festering today?
Well, I'm particularly grateful to you for that because if one is connecting the dot that I would have started with on how this penetrated the United States from within is actually the second of those, and that is the banishing of ROTC from campus. I came to Harvard from Canada, and I had always looked to the United States. Now, I'm blessed with dual citizenship, and Canada is a great country and proud to be a Canadian as well. But I had always looked to the United States and as the freer country. actually. And I came to Harvard in that spirit. And the first real greatest disappointment I had, and it remained, by the way, the greatest disappointment from the beginning to the end of my 21 years there, was the banishment of ROTC from campus. And I spoke out against it as often as it came up. I could not believe it, because you see, the age of those students is precisely when people go into the Army. And here is one of your best universities, and of course this is not just about Harvard, but it's a lot of the elite schools banished ROTC at that time, presumably against the war in Vietnam or against war and so on. But what did that mean? What it really meant, and I said this country is not worth defending. I mean, that's what it clearly says, because if you're taking the best young people at the age when they're supposed to train for the military, and you're telling them, no, the military is not allowed on this campus under any circumstances. And by the way, this kept coming up every couple of years, and things kept adding to it. Now you don't do it because of the don't ask, don't tell. Now you don't do it because of this. You see, there was always a new excuse for banning it. And it was only a small group of, well, it's always only a small group of people on the campus. But they were able to persuade the rest of their fellow faculty members, and the administration went along with it, and the Army pulled back. I mean, the military pulled back. So you have this, you have this astonishing thing. For 40 years, the military was taboo on campuses. And the kids who wanted to be, who were there on ROTC scholarships, had to go to MIT at 5 o'clock in the morning, because that was where this was available. I mean, it was such a shame. And that's, I think, where it started. This is not just anti-American. This is really determining the collapse of the country. And when you contrast it with Israel, you can see the difference. I mean, Israel is a much smaller country, much more vulnerable in every way. But my goodness, I mean, what it is to be young there, to be a high school student at the end of high school, is you're preparing to protect this country. And people vie with one another to be in the units that protect it best and most. So, by the way, I would say that if one is going to reverse anything, and this is what we all dream of, is any of this ever going to be pushed back? My first point of pushback would be 10% of the students at these universities should be there on ROTC scholarships. If you do admissions on the basis of who is in ROTC or who is in another branch of training for the military now, because of course you have now a military which needs much more than people with rifles and on tanks, right? You need an intelligence service. But I would say 10% at least of these colleges should now really, and they should insist that these kids go around in their uniforms. That this is really what, and it's, we all believe in small changes making big changes, right? And I think that would be a great start.
So you mentioned how you noticed this absence of ROTC when you set foot on the Harvard campus, when you came there. I want to also talk about some subsequent events at Harvard. In 2006, Lawrence Summers, the president of Harvard, was forced to resign after a speech he had delivered across the street at MIT on reasons why there was no parity between males and females in math and sciences. You had a front row seat for that, and you wrote what I think was just an amazing essay in commentary recently, pointing out how, in some ways, the Summers episode was the beginning of a cycle that would culminate with Claudine Gay's resignation last year. What did you take away from what happened to Larry Summers?
Well, one thing that I take away very happily now is that the Lawrence Summers who exists today is not the person who was running Harvard at that time. He has become a very feisty defender of everything that he feels is important and true. At the time, and I don't think he would disagree with that, he was, to my mind, well, I'm sorry, but he was a naïf. The first thing that happened was not the women's thing that came later. First thing that happened was that he had the courage to stand up in one of his first addresses, and he spoke out against a resolution that was being brought in from MIT to Harvard, and it was for a divestment petition signed by 70 professors. And he said, this is anti-Semitic help me out, not in intent, it is anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent. A brilliant formulation. That means that he didn't blame them for being anti-Semitic, but he said it was anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent. Okay, that was it. At the next faculty meeting, a professor of African American studies got up and said, the president of this university is denying us free speech. Now that's the trick, you see, this is so brilliant, right? He's denying us free speech. Why? Because he said that it was anti-Semitic, therefore that means what? I mean, he was expressing free speech, right? But this is what I tried to describe in the memoir as a kind of a three-step, I call it. First, you accuse Israel. Then when somebody says that's anti-Semitic, you come back and you say, oh, you're denying free speech, right? It's like a dance. And that happened. And this person did not let up, by the way. So that was the first attack. And there were people in the anthropology department. You could just see that formulation. The same people who are against ROTC really said, yes, anti-Semitism. And by the way, it made the front page of the Boston Globe the next day. Now, I found that interesting because you see, the press is not allowed at the faculty meetings. So how did the person who covers Harvard, how did he have it on the front page the next day? Right? These are calculated things. So that was the first thing. And then briefly, yes, the women's movement, that was very crude and very cruel. And also, of course, ROTC, because one of the things that Lawrence Summers did when he came in as president, he would go to the swearing-in ceremonies of ROTC. He made it clear that this was something that he approved of, right? So in other words, he was giving the impression of being, well, in those terms, of course, he's a great liberal, so on, but that was like the sign. These are conservative positions, right? To defend Israel, to be for the military. You know, these had become sort of taboo positions on the Harvard faculty. And that, as you say, the dates matter because that already goes back to 2006.
Well, it's interesting that the first attack there was on a divestment platform. So it was already kind of percolating at the turn of the 21st century. I'm struck when I look back at kind of the course of events over the past 20 years or so, there was a proliferation of BDS activity during the Obama years. What should we take away from that? Was there a change on the campus? You were at somewhat of a remove from the campuses by this point, but throughout 2013, 2014, 2015, when America entered into the nuclear deal with Iran, the campuses were raging with BDS activity, and then it seemed to have quieted down until October 7th. Was there something happening, or had it just gained a certain momentum by the 2010s that it was becoming visible?
I think the momentum was there, of course, but I think that you know, the Obama years and Obama's becoming president of the United States proves much more complicated in retrospect than it felt at the time. Obviously, we understood that this was a kind of, this had race behind it, that in a sense, the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act had passed, gloriously passed. To my mind, that should have been a turning point in America. And it was. I mean, now legally, it did what it should have done maybe 100 years earlier, of course. But there it was, a Civil Rights Act that guaranteed equality before the law, irrespective of gender, race, all these categories. So that was the great achievement. Now we were free, you see, women were fighting for that freedom, and African Americans fighting for that freedom under whatever word they wanted to choose. If it wasn't Negroes, it would be Black Americans, Black as beautiful Americans, anything that you wanted. And it had to be worked into the system, right? But then come the schools, and then comes the liberal part of the left liberal part, I don't know what to express it, that says, no, this is not good enough. Look, there's still not equality. There's still not equality of outcome. I look at the universities, now where are all these, what is the percentage of African Americans in this country? Why aren't there 10% here in this university? Now, you see, so it jumped, instead of allowing it to really live itself out and do everything possible at the early stages of education to make sure that the education is better for those who need it more, and to put more resources, human resources. What Harvard could have done, it could have established a school for African American kids who have talent and so on. And it could have done anything, but it didn't do that. What it did was the cosmetic thing from the top. Oh, let's see, if we can bring these people in, we will all pretend that everything is, equal and better and all the rest. So, so this impulse of speeding it up, when do we want it? We want it now. Well, for protesters, for young kids to say we want it now is one thing. But for the greatest universities, for the people who are supposed to say democracy requires patience, it requires teaching a generation, it is so painful. Because you see, you're talking about the introduction of ethnic studies and all that, which is, of course, part of what you say is true, that this was very destructive. But before it, let me point out, what was really happening is that Americanism was not being taught at all. That the history department, was being decimated, and people were teaching the Civil War as, the opposite of what it was. All these ideas, bad ideas were driving out the good. And people were being hired to teach those bad ideas, driving out the good. And I would put, by the way, I will bring that up. I thought that radical feminism was one of the most dangerous of these movements. It's not said often enough. I sometimes at night I watch television. I don't know what to watch, and I've become, I used to like Law and Order, and the only thing of Law and Order that you find now is Law and Order Special Victims Unit. Well, my God, I mean, I don't know, do you know what goes on? Night after night after night, every show after show. Were you raped? Oh, tell me about it. Tell me. Oh, no, you have to talk about it. Oh, no, you have to complain about it. Oh, no, you have to go in. Men as rapists, men as violent, and then the Me Too movement and all of it. But that came at the conceptual level as well. Mm-hmm. And my goodness, I mean, that is, that is catastrophic.
I want to maybe connect something. It's fascinating to me that over the course of the recent protests around the country, it's not just Israel being attacked, but certain symbols associated with the United States are being vandalized and defaced as well. So here in this city, George Washington University, the statue of George Washington went viral after it was vandalized. Of course, it's Hamilton Hall at Columbia, so named after a founding father. And then at UNC, I believe, was the episode where the frat bros protected the American flag from protesters who were targeted. What is the connection between Israel and the United States in the imagination of the antis? It seems like they see a symmetry. They go hand in hand.
Well, they do go hand in hand. I mean, it's not for nothing that one says that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and it's not the only, and that the United States of America is the great protector of the democratic world. If America is not going to be the protector of the democratic world or the free world, it's not going to be one. It is connected, and of course, part of the world has always said that. The little Satan is only a stand-in for the big Satan. But your point is the most important thing of all. That's why I say it's never about the Jews. It wasn't about the Jews in Germany. I mean, the Jews, of course, we feel it the most as Jews. That's why I called my book Free as a Jew. You know, I knew that if I put Harvard in the title, it would get reviewed. If I called it Free as a Jew, it would not get reviewed, and which is pretty much the case, of course. The Jew sounds so parochial, you see. My point is that it's the very opposite. That it's because it seems parochial that it can be used as the lever against America. If these kids were out there shouting, "Death to America," from ocean to shining ocean, we're going to take this country, I think there would be people pushing back much more than they are, right? But if you say the Jews, Israel, you see how quickly the press falls for it all. They've bought completely into the Hamas interpretation of the war. Mm-hmm. They don't blame Hamas for and this is the most pathological of all anti-Jewish enemies in history, may I say? I don't think that there's another enemy of the Jews in history that wants to kill off its own population to the last person so that the Jews can be blamed for it. Because they could not defeat the Jews militarily, but they found a way, this ingenious way, if we can suck them in and put all this ammunition underneath the civil society so that the Jews will have to come in because the attack against them was so horrific that, of course, you couldn't not come in to wipe us out. But then we've built 16 years of entrapment so that you will have to kill the whole population of Gaza. And that's why they're not surrendering and never will. That's why this is being dragged out by Hamas, because they want all the Gazans to be killed. And that's why Egypt is not allowing anyone to flee into that huge empty area that it controls, right? And this is monstrous. I mean, we focus, it's monstrous enough to want to do away with Israel, but to be willing to take your whole take your whole population and hold it hostage so that you should be able to destroy Israel? Boy, I mean, that takes a kind of genius, that takes an act of the imagination to really put yourself in that place. Now, just say parenthetically that I'm often told, "Oh, Ruth, you just don't empathize, you don't understand the other side." Well, my problem is I do understand the other side. I don't reimagine the other side. I read what they write. I pay attention to what they do. What I refuse to do is to imagine that they are like me. My civilizational ideas are very different. And it's just a fact. So one has to live with that fact.
Just maybe one or two questions for me before we turn to the audience. You said in a recent interview something that really stuck with me. There's all this discussion about liberalism and democracy going on in the United States and in the West more generally. But you put it like this. You said that liberalism is the prevention of evil rather than the promotion of good. What is that? What do you mean by that? How should we think about liberalism?
Well, I would like to take that back. Maybe not rather than. Hopefully they could be both, right? The maximalization of good, obviously. I mean that very seriously. Way back in the 1970s, I began to write a book about the liberal betrayal of the Jews. Now, what does that mean? The Jews, I was liberal. I mean, who was not liberal? That's what I grew up in. Who doesn't want to be liberal? I mean, in the best sense. And Peter Berkowitz, who is here, has written really so persuasively about not giving up that term of liberal and all that's good about it. But the fact is that what liberals are weakest at is confronting evil. And so I say, in terms of America, you have to know where your weakness lies. The weakness does not lie in this country's not wanting to maximize the good. Yes, it does. And if you take Israel, for example, my God, from day one, who can we help? You know, what catastrophe can we run to and help? The water question, how can we export that to the surrounding world? Do good, do good, do good, help, 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 do improve, you know, tikkun olam, this made-up idea of what Judaism is supposed to be, you know, improving the world. But it's there in our DNA, right, that one does that. But that's not the thing. You see it now. The question is not whether America is going to be able to improve the world, whether it's going to be able to defeat this evil that announces itself as evil, as you say, against America. Can it stand up to it? How does one do it? You know, I'm following a feed of Harvard professors who are really the most wonderful people, and they're all arguing about freedom of speech. How are we going to protect freedom of speech? You can't imagine the ingenuity, the debates, the wonderful things. Is this freedom of speech? And how does it? My God, I mean, I don't know what to say. There's not a word there about how are we going to crush this monster that we have created in our midst. Mm-hmm. Not a word about that. Mm-hmm. You see, nothing. Mm-hmm. You know, how are we going to stop these ideas? We let this happen on our campus, you see. Nothing about that. That's what I mean by making sure that you defeat evil.
Right, the test of moral clarity is the ability to recognize evil.
Exactly.
And put it, center it.
Exactly.
So we have a few moments for audience questions. We'll start right here.
Thank you very much.
If you just wait for the microphone, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I really enjoyed it. I have a sort of a compound question. There's no debating, it seems to me, that the Arab world, so to speak, has the better PR program, and it's kind of jaw-dropping as to how much there is of an historical misunderstanding in the United States and on college campuses. What do you think is necessary to turn that around? And even if you did turn that around with good historical education, how much would that fix the problem? And how much is just the anti-Semitism just deeply endemic to the society?
So interesting that you ask that, because, you know, in the few minutes that we had talking just among ourselves before, this is exactly what came up. How come that we can't fight back in the culture? I was saying that today, you know, sometimes I can't even name how many wonderful people there are writing today, have great ideas. And they're all the young people. I mean, there are more voices today that are speaking with moral clarity and with sanity than I have ever imagined, let alone seen in my lifetime. They're all there. But it doesn't make a dent in the culture. And it isn't affecting anything. So that is the big question, is how do you make it, I would say, you know, how do you make it popular? How do you get it to, how do you get people to know that it is wonderful to stand up and be, you know, and be morally clear, and to stand up against goons and thugs of the mind as well as of the body. I think part of it is really a kind of follow the leader thing. My great disappointment, for example, is this, you know, I spend a lot of time talking about Jews in culture and in literature and so on. Well, you know, do you realize that all these filmmakers, these Jewish filmmakers, all these people who are writing television programs, everybody, they have not made one movie about the greatness of what, to my mind, is the greatest human miracle on a collective basis ever. And that is in the 1940s, in the same decade that a third of the Jewish people was not just eliminated, but in conditions that are just unspeakable. In that same decade, Jews recovered their sovereignty in the country that had been under foreign domination for 2,000 years. Now, where in human history do you find something like that? So to my mind, the Exodus story that we go over and pass over is really a fantastic story. But what does the Exodus story have to compare with the rise of Israel in the 1940s? You see what I mean? It's to say the greatest story ever told, but guess what? It's made by Cecil B. DeMille. It's made by others. And the book Exodus was made...
Well, I was going to say Paul Newman's movie.
Paul Newman's movie.
But that in itself is revealing, because that came out decades ago, and of course, the most famous American Jewish filmmaker, Steven Spielberg, made Munich.
Yes, exactly.
That's his story of Israel.
Exactly.
It's not Exodus.
Absolutely. And if you read... And Munich was supposed to be this great thing where the Mossad actually took out all these murderers and how they did it. But in his thing, it's guilt. Oh my God, Munich, that operation in which Netanyahu's brother was killed. I mean, it was a fantastic operation. So in other words, we're afraid of our own bravery. We're afraid of all that's good about us. We're afraid, I don't mean, chest thumping, you understand that. But you have to laboriously teach that. I will come back to, when I was coming to America to become an American, I knew pitifully little about the history of this country and all. But I started to read the Federalist Papers. Well, I had never read anything like that. And I would cry. I mean, I had never read anything that stirred me so. And this was something I don't see anybody say. Guess what it begins with? I mean, I'm telling you all, you know what it begins with. How do we defend ourselves? That's the first thing they think of as the great value of having a federalist government, right? They're not maximizing the good to begin with. The first thing they're thinking, how do we protect this great thing that we are building here? You see, that's how sane people think. Now, what are we teaching our children? Why don't we say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning? If you don't say the Pledge of Allegiance, then do you express allegiance? One has to, at Harvard meetings, I would say, democracy is not biologically transmitted. And no one, it was not the popular view, may I say. But it has to be done. I mean, the school, and it has to be done on the popular level too. But this is, I'm speaking to the people who do it.
Here in front. Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. My name's Deborah Weiss. That was a phenomenal speech. I never say that, just so you know. Thank you so much for coming. I was wondering if you could comment on and give an analysis of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that was just passed in the House, and specifically, the two questions I have about it are the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, a certain perception that's really vaguely worded, and some of the examples like the Jews killed Jesus, which, obviously we didn't all do it, but, I'm not sure that should be the definition. And then the second thing is, I'm almost afraid to bring this up after your comments, but the free speech issue, I totally understand that the issue is, how did we get here? Why did they think this? How can we crush it? But there are a number of conservatives, including like Ben Shapiro, who's obviously an Orthodox Jew, and Charlie Kirk, Matt Walsh, who oppose this and fire because in this situation, in addition to addressing the issue, do we or do we not allow them speech? To what extent? And I'm hearing that your comments on the moral part, but we still have to address to what extent do we let them speak? And
Of
could you
course.
comment on those?
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry
No,
for being,
thanks.
sorry for being long.
No, they're fantastic questions. No, of course, free speech is, of course, one has to allow it. The only serious argument, may I say, in 65 years of marriage, my husband died very recently, and the only, can you imagine, 65 years, was over Skokie. My husband was a lawyer, and he said they've got to march in Skokie. Nazis.
This is the neo-Nazi group.
This is the neo-Nazis in Skokie. Skokie was a Jewish neighborhood. He said they've got to. That's freedom of speech. And I said, look, I'm not comfortable with that. They're only going to Skokie because that's where the Jews are. It's only provocative and so on. But he said they've got to march. He won. I ceded, and I would in that sense. But I would say that in that situation, if it were Nazi Germany, what would you say? So you've got to take the measure of the society or of where you are at any given time. Yes, of course, free speech to the max. But when you see that the people who want to destroy free speech and all your freedoms with it are the ones who are not just marching, but they have gained the power over your institutions, then you have to worry, as the other question was, why haven't we been able to persuade people of what we want to persuade them of? So you first have to make sure that this is being protected. In other words, you understand that you have to have the society that allows free speech to be protected so that you can have freedom of speech. Does that make sense? That's the point. And when you are losing the society, and when you feel that actually it's going to be destroyed, and it can be destroyed. It doesn't have to be, not everything is Nazism in Germany. There's, the Soviet Union, there are many models. But if the weakness is so great that it's actually, bad ideas have driven out the good, then what do? Then, you have to find a way of protecting the country that exists. And I think that, much more has to be done to make sure that this is what kids are being taught. They have to be taught what an amazing country this is. What an amazing system of government this is. What it means to have checks and balances. But if you don't teach that, how can you have it as, how can the society perpetuate itself? It just won't happen.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the final question. Of course, you're all welcome to join us at the reception afterward. As a Ruth Wisse stan, I've read pretty much everything you've written. And in one of those essays, you wrote that post-1948, a Jew will be judged by how he or she defended the state of Israel. How he or she defended the state of Israel. How best can we defend the state of Israel post-October 7th?
Well, look, all the people I know who want to defend it are finding ways of defending it. It is not simple. And in this country, it's particularly complicated. But I would say that if you're an American and you want to protect the state of Israel, the only way to do it effectively is through the government that you elect. Because without the support of the United States of America, Ukraine will not exist. And Israel, strong as it is, and independent as it has to remain, it can't do it without American backing. And to feel the American government of the moment playing with Israel, playing with it for some mean political advantage, which will not even become a political advantage. That is so disappointing. At this hour of what that country is going through. So this is what we do, I think. We elect. And that's what one does, support.
With that, please join me in thanking Ruth Wisse for her remarkable lecture.